It began with a single message, a cryptic text that appeared on David's phone late one night. "The dead never rest, especially those forgotten. Come find me, if you dare." The glow of the screen bathed David's face in a pale light as he sat up in his dark room, heart pounding. It was past midnight, and the message came from an unknown number. He stared at it, unease prickling his skin. He had no idea that by the time dawn broke, his life would be changed forever. His finger hovered over the delete button, but some deep, inexplicable pull, stopped him. He hesitated, and then the phone vibrated again. Another message. "Do you remember the grave you disturbed?" David's blood ran cold. That grave. He hadn't thought about it in years, how he and his friends years ago had spent a summer night at the old, forgotten cemetery on a dare. They had gone searching for the legendary, unmarked grave, the one locals whispered about. They had laughed it off, thinking it was all just stories, until they found it. The memories came rushing back. How the dirt had felt unervingly soft under his hands, the way the wind had picked up suddenly, whispering through the trees like a warning. They had left in a hurry, but David had returned the next day to satisfy his curiosity. Only, when he got there, the grave seemed different. The markers they had found were gone, and he swore the soil had shifted, as if something had been disturbed beneath. That was years ago, and now the dead were calling. David found himself driving out of town before dawn, heading towards the old cemetery. The sky was still dark, only a faint hint of light on the horizon. As he approached the cemetery, the trees on either side of the road seemed to close in, their twisted branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The gate was rusted and groaned as he pushed it open. The cold air bit into his skin, and the smell of damp earth filled his nose. A low mist clung to the ground, snaking through the gravestones like a living thing. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a crow. David felt as though he were being watched, but every time he glanced around, the cemetery was empty. Still, the sensation of unseen eyes never left him. He found the old plot where the unmarked grave had been, though the gravestone he had expected was no longer there. Instead, a new one stood, freshly carved. "For those who disturbed my rest." David's heart skipped a beat. He knelt, running his fingers over the words, but the stone was ice cold. As he stood, a sudden gust of wind swirled the mist around him, carrying with it a faint voice, almost too soft to hear. It was as if the cemetery itself whispered, urging him to leave. But he couldn't. Something far more powerful than curiosity, kept him there. David was no stranger to strange occurrences, but what happened next made him question everything. As he turned to leave the grave, something caught his eye. Footprints, deep, fresh footprints in the damp soil, leading away from the grave. He hadn't seen them when he arrived. They weren't his. Following the trail, David's heart thudded in his chest. The footprints led towards the woods beyond the cemetery, the dark trees standing tall like sentinels, guarding some terrible secret. He hesitated at the edge of the forest, but the pull of the footprints was irresistible. Step after step, he ventured into the darkness, the canopy above swallowing the morning light, plunging him into near blackness. Halfway through the forest, the footprints suddenly stopped, disappearing into thin air. There was no logical explanation. It was as if whoever, or whatever, had made them had vanished. His breath came in shallow gasps, fear creeping into the edges of his mind. And then, the ground beneath him gave way. David tumbled down a steep slope, landing hard at the bottom of a hidden ravine. Pain shot through his ankle, and as he tried to stand, something brushed against his leg. His eyes widened in horror as he realized he had landed beside a skeletal hand, half buried in the dirt. The rest of the body was still partially covered, but the sight of the bones, pale and ancient, sent a jolt of terror through him. Just as he was about to scramble away, a voice echoed through the trees, soft, almost melodic, but unmistakably menacing. "You shouldn't have come back." David wasn't the bravest man, nor was he particularly superstitious, but the gravity of what was happening began to break him down. He was an ordinary man, caught up in something far beyond his understanding. His hands shook as he fumbled for his phone, hoping for a signal. There was none. His thoughts raced. What had he done to deserve this? What did the voice want? And why him, of all people? Suddenly, the memories of his teenage years came flooding back. He had been reckless then, daring to disturb what was better left alone. He and his friends had laughed about it afterward, mocking the old legends and calling it nonsense. But deep down, David had always felt guilty. Now, it seemed the past had come to collect its due. The forest was silent now, except for the pounding of David's heart in his ears. He limped through the dense underbrush, trying to escape the ravine, but no matter which direction he went, the woods seemed to stretch on endlessly. Time felt warped, distorted. Every few moments, he heard rustling behind him, and his pace quickened. The terror mounted as something unseen stalked him, always just out of sight, but never too far behind. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped again. David turned slowly, his breath caught in his throat. Nothing. But then the trees. They began to shift, their branches twisting unnaturally, like bones contorting. And from between the trees, a figure stepped forward, a woman, pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow, her lips cracked and dry. She wore a tattered dress, and her bony fingers stretched out towards him. "David," she whispered, her voice like the wind through the trees. "You took what wasn't yours." David stumbled back, his foot catching on a root. He fell hard, the air knocked out of his lungs. When he looked up again, the woman was gone. Fear gnawed at David's mind. Was the woman real? Was this all in his head? Exhaustion and panic blurred the line between reality and imagination. His memories of the past became twisted, fragmented. He questioned everything he had seen that night in the cemetery, doubting his own sanity. He pressed forward, desperate to escape, but the forest became a labyrinth. No matter how hard he tried to find a way out, the trees seemed to shift and move, trapping him within their maze. His thoughts spiraled, the oppressive darkness playing tricks on his mind. Whispers filled the air, voices, soft and taunting, urging him to give up, to surrender to the forest's embrace. As David stumbled through the woods, the realization hit him. He wasn't just lost in the forest. He was lost in time. The woods seemed to shift around him, trapping him in a liminal space, somewhere between life and death. A shadow moved in the distance, but whenever David turned to face it, it vanished. The dread of something unseen, watching him from the darkness, gnawed at his nerves. He had no idea what lurked in the shadows, only that it was drawing closer. Subtle signs began to emerge, hinting at the truth behind the supernatural events. The messages on his phone, the footsteps, the ravine, they all pointed to something David had overlooked that night at the cemetery. Something had been disturbed, something buried deep beneath the earth. A spirit wronged, forgotten for centuries, now awake and seeking revenge. David began to piece it together. The woman in the woods, was she the one buried in the unmarked grave? Did she want him to make amends for what he had done? The supernatural elements in the story felt grounded. The woman in the woods was not an over-the-top apparition. She was haunting but believable. Her presence had a purpose, a reason tied to the real-world events of the cemetery. And as the haunting continued, it became clear that there were rules that David had broken. The deeper David ventured into the woods, the more these rules unraveled. The thin boundary between the living and the dead had been breached, and now the supernatural was bleeding into his world. Every step he took felt like crossing further into the unknown. Finally, after hours of wandering, David stumbled back to the cemetery. The gravestone was gone again, replaced by a fresh mound of dirt. His heart raced as he knelt beside it, hands trembling. He had to make things right, but he didn't know how. As he dug through the soft earth, desperate to uncover what lay beneath, the ground shifted. He froze. Slowly, a pale hand emerged from the soil, followed by the gaunt, hollow-eyed face of the woman from the woods. Her expression was one of sorrow, not anger, and as her cold fingers touched his skin, David realized too late what she wanted. "You will take my place," she whispered, her voice soft as a lullaby. Before he could scream, before he could fight, the world faded to black. And that, dear viewers, was the forgotten grave. Scary tales from the beyond. If you think you've escaped the terror, think again. This was just the beginning. If you want more spine-chilling horror, make sure to check out my next video on horror stories by clicking the link on your screen. You never know when the next story might haunt you.